Hey everybody, welcome back. I am here with Alex and Debbie who are joining me for this second episode of Unraveling Reality. We're continuing to look at the Carlos Castaneda tensegrity story and all of its relationships to the Netflix show, The OA. And so I've kind of put together a presentation on the connections that I see and maybe my theories on what may or may not have happened to these women and Carlos himself. And, maybe the fact that the show, the OA, might have borrowed a lot more heavily from this story than they would like people to think. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. And hopefully everybody can see this. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see that. All right, cool. So I don't even know if I can play it. I'm gonna have to move that. There we go. So really getting into this was so interesting to me. I was looking at all the parallels and the connections as I was investigating the Castaneda story, and really the story of these women is at the heart of this whole thing. And so the mainstream narrative kind of goes like this. Carlos Castaneda has some sort of experience in Mexico with this guy named Don Juan. He writes a book about it while he's a student at UCLA trying to get a PhD in anthropology. His first book gets published, and he writes two subsequent books, and those books become the basis for his, like, UCLA issuing him his PhD in anthropology. And then in 1973, several people begin digging into it and thoroughly debunk all of his work, showing that he plagiarized all of these different sources and attributed them to Don Juan. And he kind of disappears from public view in 1973, and he buys this house, and these women start to move in with him and begin to, for all intents and purposes, it seems like people think it was a cult. And so he starts this cult. He brainwashes these women. He sleeps with them. He manipulates them. And then at some point, he's making all this money. He's very secretive. He gets them to cut ties with their family. And then he gets cancer. And so according to him, he's a sorcerer. He's not supposed to get sick, but now he has cancer and then he dies. And so because these women have, given their entire life to him and cut ties, and they just feel so much shame, that the day after he dies, 5 women collectively decide to disappear and commit suicide out in the desert, but only one of them is found, and the other 4 are still missing and at large. So that's kind of like the mainstream story. It's a guy created a cult and he died, and the women who followed him committed suicide because they couldn't take it that he was dead. End of story, right? And Debbie and Alex have both been big followers of Castaneda's work. And when they found out about this whole thing, it impacted them kind of negatively. And it was hard to take. And having never really been into Castaneda and never heard any of this stuff before, I came at it from a different perspective, and, just familiarizing myself with his work and the things that he was teaching. And then looking at some other connections, I feel like the mainstream narrative of this story is lacking, and none of it really makes any sense anyway. So just to start out, I found this guy. This guy posted something, and I thought it was worth noting. It's like, if you start with cynicism, assuming the worst, you will usually wind up seeing nothing but the worst, because it's what you'll seek out and attract. Your initial intent dictates, in large part, what you'll wind up being in the end. A work of apparent fiction can be more true than a work of nonfiction when the reality it describes is alien to our worldview, because nothing in our real world experience is up to the task of addressing it. And I thought that was very, very fitting for this story, because the things that Castaneda teaches and talks about, there isn't really a frame of reference in our reality to accept this kind of stuff. We're taught that there is nothing beyond this physical world, and it was all random, and there is no God, there's no afterlife, there's no spirit, there's no soul, there's none of this. And so his work gets into things that can't really tangibly be proven, at least not through the normal scientific methods that have been accepted for the last 100 years or so. And so I first want to start off by talking about a key figure in all of this, and that's this woman here. This is Kathleen Adair Pullman, aka Carol Teagues. And she was the first child born to Harriet Whitbeck Pullman. She was born in 1947, Michael. This will tie in with some things Michael and I have been talking about. And then so in 1965, Castaneda ends his apprenticeship with Don Juan. And then roughly, 1966, early 67, Carol Teagues supposedly meets Don Juan in Mexico, as per a lecture she gave. And we'll see what she says about this. But I want to note that Carol Teagues, if you're looking at the connections with the OA, Carol Teagues would be like the Prairie Johnson character in the OA. And you'll start to see why. So she says here that, she met Castaneda and Don Juan when she was 19. She was in Mexico City studying art history. So she was in a different city. She was all on her own. And she's describing this night that she's walking through this park, and she sees these two men approaching her kind of menacingly. And I think Carlos Castaneda comes up to her, and like Don Juan says, "Don't let her get away. Grab her by the leg if you can." And he starts asking her all these questions. Are you an American? What's your name? How old are you? Do you have a boyfriend? And she panics, but then apparently Don Juan lets out a huge belch, and she's frozen, and she answers the questions. And then she says that the young man, Carlos, was revolted by my lisp. So they make this big deal in all the things I'm reading about her lisp and how she has this disability. Prairie Johnson was also blind. She had been blind since maybe 8-10 years old when she had a near-death experience, and she went into this infinity room and met this woman named Katoon, and she took her sight, but she gave her life back. And so, Carol has this lisp, and she I guess she talks to them. They visit her while she's in Mexico. By the time she returned home, a fog had closed in around the memory of those two men. Upon her return, she told her parents about her vague half memories of being accosted by two Mexicans and her inability to remember what happened after that. Her parents thought she had been drugged and molested. So it's very interesting that she has very foggy recollection of her meeting with him in the first place. Just like when Prairie meets Hap for the first time in New York, and she's playing the violin in the subway station. Of course, his meeting with her isn't nearly as menacing, and he's sort of romancing her and getting her to follow him because she's blind. But anyway, moving on. So Carol filed for a name change, and she stated that her father had died. And so somebody verified that he had indeed died according to Social Security records. It looks like he was a doctor of ophthalmology, right? And in the OA, Prairie's father had also died, although she kept thinking he was still alive, and she was determined to find him, which is why she went to New York in the first place. But he had died in that particular reality, and she was adopted by this family in America. So in 1973, she meets Castaneda in 66, 67. And so about 7 years later, she supposedly leaves with or around the same time as Don Juan and his party. And so there's, in his book, Castaneda describes Don Juan moving into another dimension with several other people in his party. And Carol Teagues was supposedly one of those people that went with him. And so, she disappears and nobody knows where she's at. Much like the way Prairie Johnson, after she goes to New York, just vanishes and disappears for 7 years. And then there's this whole narrative about the death defier, right? And so we're going to get to that in like another slide here. This is where Carol is describing her disappearance, and she doesn't really remember a whole lot about where she went or what she experienced. But the things she is describing have some similarities to the OA. And so it says, she then described in detail the fateful day on which she met the death defier. So to me, in my mind, this is going to be like the Katoon character. This is like an entity that is existing in another reality that she's interacting with. And as a result of this meeting, she said there are 3 possibilities as to whether Carol Teagues still exists. This is her talking about herself. The first is that she does. The second is that she doesn't. And the third is that she has the essence of Carol Teagues, but also something else. So now she's referring to herself as not the same person as she was when she left. And so this gets into like Prairie having this experience and then coming back and, referring to herself as the OA, the original angel. So now she's something else, but she's still herself. She described this meeting as a hot, bright day. And she says the death defier told Carol that she wanted something from her and would give her anything in return. Carol couldn't answer. The death defier said it was not something she could decide for her, that it was totally up to Carol, but that it would be a great adventure. This was the key phrase to convince Carol, who was always looking for adventure. So Carol said yes. The death defier then said, let's change this dream and sit beside the sea of awareness. Carol said she was excited, envisioning they were going to the beach. The death defier took her back outside through the small doorway. So before this, she had gone into this doorway, and she was in this very, very dark room. And then this entity led her back outside. And there's a scene in the OA where she's outside in this beautiful, beautiful, serene nature setting. And then she finds this little shack and she goes inside this door and she's in this infinity room. And we'll see how a lot of this ties in many different ways. And so let's see, where the death defier took her back outside through the small doorway. They went from the blackness of the church to the brilliance of the outdoors. It was very bright, and eventually Carol said she started getting some flashes of something. The sea awareness was somehow alive, like I thought God was as a child, and impersonal, but somehow personal to each person. As a person, she felt like a speck, but somehow very intimate with this impersonal entity. Then I suddenly felt pain in my left foot. I found myself walking in the streets of Tucson. I saw a newspaper, and the date was 10 years later. So this is when she now returns from wherever she was, the sea of awareness. And so 10 years have passed in this reality, but in the reality that she was in, it seemed like maybe just a few moments, maybe 10 hours had passed. These are scenes from the OA, and this is the infinity room, and this is the woman, Katoon, that she meets inside of this room. And so as you're looking at it, it's almost like an infinite black space with all of these lights sort of representing distant stars, like she's in space. But there's a doorway, and you can see almost outside that this was like pristine, beautiful coastline. So she was near the sea, and she walked into this room, and she meets this being, Katoon. And this is going to have similarities as well to another person that also disappeared, Tasha Abelar, and we'll get to that. So she disappears in 1973, and then in 1983, she returns from what they're calling the second attention. supposedly finding herself in Tucson, Arizona, right? And so, like, she finds Castaneda somehow at this book reading, and he is calling her the Nagual woman. So now, just like Prairie Johnson gets this title, the OA, and people start calling her OA, they're now referring to Carol Teagues as the Nagual woman. So I just wanted to point that out. And so she meets up with him. Castaneda is doing a reading at a bookshop in, I think it was Los Angeles, and she just shows up there. She said she had been looking for him for like 2 years, but anyway, she finds him and now she just is right back in the fold with him. Now, there was a researcher that talked about the timeline of Carol and the fact that there are documents showing that she enrolled in acupuncture school in the late 70s and graduated and had married a guy that she was going to school with, presumably in Vegas, I believe, and that she had been living a seemingly normal life as a normal person when she walked away in 73. So there's this idea that she never went anywhere, and that, you know, Carol just sort of got tired of everything and wanted to lead a normal life. But then 10 years later, for whatever reason, she finds Castaneda. She's had enough of acupuncture and her husband, and she divorces him and takes back up with Castaneda. So none of that makes any sense. Whether or not she actually physically traveled to, you know, another dimension is debatable, but let's say that she stayed and she was leading this seemingly normal life. That doesn't seem like the trajectory that the original Carol Teagues would have taken. And as she describes it, when she came back, she felt like she wasn't herself anymore. So maybe her body stayed here. They, you know, Castaneda talks about this, the double, and that, you know, some people have this double. And so there is the possibility that her consciousness went somewhere else, and that Carol Teagues, the physical body, stayed here and just was living out a normal life. And then upon her return, Carol Teagues' consciousness took back over. And you'll see this in the OA when Prairie travels into another dimension. She travels into her body in another dimension, but that person is named Nina Azarova, which was her actual birth name before she was adopted in the reality that she came from.
Could I just add one bit, Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, that really reminds me of, and I don't know if you've watched all of Twin Peaks yet. You were watching, I think, series 1 and 2. The doppelganger plays a major part in the last series, and how the main characters like split into two, and he goes into that like infinity room where Laura Palmer was initially, and she was held up there. Like, that story seems very similar to me too.
Yeah, very, very good point, Alex. The Black Lodge and the doppelganger, there seems to be the same concept of, you know, another dimension that seems infinite and strange, hard to describe. And there seems to be this idea of the double in that as well. And that, you know, the double can cross back over. So when Cooper comes out of the Black Lodge at the end of season 2, it's not really the Cooper that went in, right? It's this doppelganger that has been possessed by the demon Bob. And so, you know, that's a very plausible explanation as to why Carol Teagues seems to have still been here living a normal life, and yet somehow, you know, her double or the Carol that traveled then came back, and that one consciousness dominates the other. And in the OA, you see that too, because she travels to another dimension. She takes over the body of Nina Azarova, who is now seemingly not conscious anymore. So Prairie Johnson, her consciousness is at the forefront of the vessel. And eventually she has to try to integrate, I think they call it recapitulation in Castaneda's work, right? Where you're trying to merge with the double, right? Or create energy to send the double somewhere. So in the OA, she has to integrate with the other consciousness. So she absorbs her memories, her feelings and everything, and they become like one consciousness. And you would imagine that the more she goes into other realities where she's experiencing other parts of her consciousness, this would continue to happen to the point where, you know, she would be a fully integrated being beyond, you know, there's no more fractals of her consciousness to absorb, right? So this is the idea that comes to me when I'm thinking about Carol Teagues and her inexplicable disappearance, but also the fact that there are documents showing that she was still around. So in order to make this all make sense, right, this idea is already built into the teachings of Castaneda. So it's not like, oh, here, look, see, she didn't go anywhere, so you're a fraud. No, I don't think you can quickly jump to that conclusion at all.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about the double. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So there were, in Castaneda's teachings, there were, among his apprentices, people were either dreamers, quote unquote dreamers, or they were stalkers. Castaneda himself was a stalker, considered a stalker, which is interesting if you get into the definition of stalker, which I won't do here, but a dreamer, she may have been a dreamer, Carol Tiggs, and I can't remember offhand, but that would be interesting to look into, because the dreaming body is the other name for the double. And the recapitulation is actually a technique which is to reclaim any energy that you lose during your living, you know, day-to-day living, and your past as well, energy and unwanted ties can be gotten rid of that way too. So you gain a lot of energy through recapitulating, and that can be used, yes, towards your dreaming body, which is your double. So it'd be interesting to find out if she was a dreamer. She may have been, and that would fit in with the teachings.
Yeah, I don't remember one way or the other which one she was. I do remember reading about the stalkers and the dreamers, and that Castaneda was a stalker. I think Don Juan was also a stalker, was he not? But yeah, she could have very well been a dreamer, and you know, it's quite possible, because they call her the Nagua woman, and so they didn't expect to ever see her again, right? Once Don Juan and her left, there was this expectation that they'd never be seen again, and that Castaneda had work to do. But her return seemed to signal like there was something different had changed, and that their whole mission had changed. And so 1973 to 1983, Castaneda was kind of laying low, and he had, you know, some women that were following him. But it's really around the time she returned that he really shifted gears and started to push tensegrity and, you know, start a lot of these companies. Because by 93, or was it 93 or 95, tensegrity, or Clear Green, the company that distributed tensegrity, really started to take off. Another interesting tidbit, though, is, you know, she said when she was back from wherever she went, she found herself in Tucson, Arizona. And 10 years later, you know, it was hard for her to even recognize the place, but Don Juan had apparently had her hide packets of money in different places around different towns. And she thought it was absurd at the time, but now she understood perfectly. So my question is, if she eventually went for these packets of money that were hidden in 1983 when she returned, if she had never actually left, why would she not have already gathered that money and used it, right? So she seemingly left this stuff where it was, even though she was physically still in this reality, going to college and getting married. So, you know, I still think that in some way she left, and for 10 years, her consciousness was somewhere else having a different experience. And so this is what Castaneda, had to say about it. He said, there is someone who goes into the unknown and waits for us to join her. She's called Carol Teagues, my counterpart. She was with us, then vanished. Her disappearance lasted 10 years. Where she went is inconceivable. It does not yield to rationality. So please suspend judgment. Carol Teagues went away. She was not living in the mountains of New Mexico, I assure you. One day I was giving a lecture at the Phoenix bookstore and she materialized. My heart jumped out of my shirt, fomp, fomp, fomp. I kept talking. I talked for 2 hours without knowing what I was saying. I took her outside and asked her where she had been. 10 years. She became cagey and started to sweat. She had only vague recollections. She made jokes. The reappearance of Carol Teagues opened an enormous door energetically through which we can go. Her return gave us a new ring of power. She brought with her a tremendous mass of energy that allows us to come out. That's why we are available at this moment. And so what he's referring to, and Carol will talk about this as well, is her return sort of marked this idea that Castaneda and other people in his party could now travel as well. Since Castaneda never traveled with Don Juan in 73, now he saw it as possible for him to travel as well. But for right now, I want to shift gears and I want to talk about this woman here, Tasha Abelar. And thank you, Debbie, for putting me on to this book. This is an excerpt from her book, The Sorcerer's Crossing. And I just want you to listen to what she's saying here. This is at the end of her book. The feeling I had developed for the trees was beyond words. And so just to preface this, she was staying at this house that had sort of strange magical properties to it. And she was training to be a sorcerer. And at this house, she was living in this tree, and it was part of her training, but she eventually came to communicate and interact with this tree. So just keep that in mind. I had the certainty that I was able to absorb their moods, know their age, their insights, and what they sensed. I could communicate with the tree directly through a sensation that came out from the inside of my body. So that's her talking about this tree that she had come to be living in, and she was able to communicate with these other trees as well. And then the guy who is training her takes her into the house. She's already been in this room that he takes her into, but this time it's different. And he shows her something curious. It's like a room that just has a bunch of stuff in it, seemingly like it's just junk that has been collected and just sitting in this room. So she's describing what she's experiencing at this time. The room I had crossed a moment ago had disappeared. Instead, I was staring at a vast flat space illuminated by a peach-colored glow. The room now extended out into seemingly infinite space right before my very eyes. The horizon in my view was jet black. I gasped again, for I had a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. I felt the floor was moving out from under my feet and I was being pulled into that space. And so I didn't want to put all of the quotes in here, but she gets into the fact that there was two different things that she experienced in this room. The first one was that she was in this seemingly infinity room, right? She was looking out into infinity and she was stunned. She couldn't talk. She was shaking. And then the guy turned her around and he put her in front of a table that had a black curtain, right? Also reminiscent of the Black Lodge with the red curtain. And so she's able to then see into the house, presumably into other dimensions. She can see the multiverse, and she's watching people that she's never met before in the house that she's supposedly in. And the guy's telling her that you'll eventually meet these people, but not right now. So there's this idea of communicating with trees, and these trees being right outside this house that has these magical properties, and it has a window into the multiverse, and also, you know, access to this infinity room or whatever you want to call it, right? And so here we see in season 2 of the OA, Prairie now sort of integrated with Nina Azarova, the woman's whose body she jumped into, which it's still her, but it's 2 different consciousnesses now integrated. And part of the plot of this the second season of the OA is that there is a missing girl who is playing an alternate reality game or a puzzle game that leads people eventually to this strange house in San Francisco. And you know, the end of the game is being run by this billionaire tech guy who Nina is dating at the time in this reality. So Prairie Johnson doesn't have any memory of that until she integrates with Nina. But this guy, Pierre Ruskin, he's running this ARG in order to, you know, farm out the work for people to solve problems for him that he's not able to solve. And he has a bunch of other people that are in this room. They're all around in a circle and they're all dreaming. And he has people analyzing their dreams. And this is reminiscent of another show called Falling Water, where it talks about shared dreaming and lucid dreaming. So also just another avenue to go into, which I didn't really want to throw all of that into this at the time because it's just too much already. But there's a scene in the show where Nina and this detective are in this house, and it's a puzzle. The whole house is a puzzle that needs to be solved in order to get to eventually the rose window, which is at the top of the house. And there's only one way to get there, and it's through the bottom of the house, where you actually have to go inside of a deep well and unleash this flow of water that pushes you up into this room that you come up into like an attic. And there is a round rose-colored window that when opened will allow you to see into the multiverse. Before that, Nina crawls out a window and crawls out onto this massive tree, and then is subsequently sucked down underneath the ground, where she is tangled up in its roots and begins communicating with the tree, right? So I found this parallel, you know, quite interesting. And this little, you know, it says Prairie and Kareem go through a sewer that leads them inside the house on Nob Hill. They then solve some of the house's puzzles together until they somehow split from each other. And eventually, Prairie journeys deeper inside, where she comes across a flock of living telepathic trees that tell her that Hap is planning to make a powerful discovery that would make her lose her faith. The trees warn Prairie to form a tribe, and that Nina is the key to doing so. So yet again, some more parallels between Tasha Abelar's experiences and season 2 of the OA.
You also have there's a little parallel with Twin Peaks with the telepathic log, possibly.
Yes.
And the tree as well is also in the Infinity Room. There's a kind of, what's it called again? I forget the name. Sorry.
So it's like the character Mike had said that he cut off his arm, and that the arm is Bob. And so in the Black Lodge, his arm or Bob is represented by this tree.
Oh, okay. I hadn't watched season 1 and 2 for so long, and I watched 3, and it was like jumping into complete mystery again. But I remember that crazy tree. The tree had a doppelganger too. The
tree doesn't come up in season 1 or season 2. It actually appears in the movie Fire Walk with Me.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. I thought I'd seen it before, but maybe I'd missed out watching that when I rewatched it.
It might also show up in season 3 that ran on Showtime. I still haven't rewatched that, but that's on my list to continue the Twin Peaks series. But so here's a shot of the house. You can see up here the window from the outside, and here's a shot of, you know, when somebody actually reaches it and they're going to open it. And when this detective finally gets up there, they're looking for the missing girl, this girl, Michelle, who has disappeared and is presumed to be somewhere in this house. But as we come to find out, Michelle found the rose window and traveled, and Kareem, the detective, finds the window as well, and he pulls her back out. So when he's looking out the window through, like out down this way, what he's actually seeing is a soundstage, and he's looking out at all of these people who are, you know, this would be our reality, right? So when he sees Britt Marling and Jason Isaacs, the people who play the characters on the show, it's like this is the set of the show that he's looking through the window at. So he's looking into this other reality where they're actors making a show about this. And he pulls this girl back from this reality. She climbs up the ladder and he pulls her into the window. And then she, you know, is saved and reunited with her grandmother who had been looking for her. She is also the character of Buck in the other reality that Prairie traveled from. So now, you know, you're getting into the doppelganger, the double idea that, you know, everyone or most people have a double or a doppelganger, and whether or not they exist in this reality or not, you know, who knows, but.
And also the breaking of the fourth wall in there is also like similar to Stopping the World, that kind of breaking out of this reality and going into that other reality.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a very surrealistic scene, you know, that you're in the show and you're looking through a window at the show's production going on. It's, yeah. And, you know, I've seen this done in several other TV shows as well, trying to, you know, incorporate that idea, breaking that fourth wall. So here we have, I just wanted to share this. So the movements that we see in the OA that I talked about on the last video are very similar to the movements that were taught in tensegrity. And here we see Kylie Lundahl, one of the women who vanished, performing these movements. And so I thought this was interesting. I found this article. This guy Heffington is the choreographer who designed the moves for the show, the OA. And he said the process of creating the movements seen on the show involved many conversations and required sharing common reference points with Marling and Batmanglij, who was the other guy who created the show with her. A lot of them were based on natural things, he explains. Not all animals, just organic, natural references, whether it's ancient tribal dance or Heffington trails off for a second. I don't want to give away too much. Like, what does that even mean? I don't want to give away too much. Like, then it goes on to say that the veil of secrecy surrounding the OA is undoubtedly part of its appeal. The show's release date was revealed only a week before it dropped, and its promotional rollout involved cryptic social media posts. So again, we have that concept of an ARG as a promotional technique for a show that is about an ARG that's being played in San Francisco. And, you know, you see that this connection with the ARG come up with Castaneda, because, you know, the last video I did, I asked, you know, was he playing an ARG? Was he the puppet master, or was he simply just an actor in someone else's ARG? So there's all of these strange connections. And the fact that you would have to surround this show and where you got the inspiration for these movements in secrecy is just bizarre to me, because most people thought the show was silly. Like, Michael has had an aversion to watching it because it seemed very silly to him, like these movements. And I'm sure there's other reasons, but a lot of people felt that way. You know, they watch the trailer and they see the movements and they're like, what is this? This is stupid. I'm not watching this. So, you know, it has that it has that feeling of absurdity to it. And I think it did turn a lot of people off, which might have been the point, because, you know, there's a lot that's revealed in this show. And so here's what Britt Marling was saying about the movements. We're a bunch of actors. We're not dancers. We're not even necessarily particularly athletic, some of us, and we're just showing up in our sweats in a room. We've all just met each other, and now we're going to move our body in ways we've never moved them before. And we're going to do it in front of each other. In the beginning, you're embarrassed, you're ashamed, you laugh a little to make it feel okay. But by the time we were doing those movements for 2 or 3 months on end, something otherworldly starts to happen in your own body and starts to happen between people who are doing them. So I think that's sort of just a hint or a revelation that, you know, the movements that they were doing actually do something. I don't think she wants to actually come out and admit just what that is, but, you know, it's pretty telling. And then they asked the creator of the movements, do you want the audience to believe that these movements could have some kind of supernatural power? Definitely. That was his response. I definitely want people to think that. So, you know, I mean, of course, the tensegrity movements, which are very similar that we talked about, that was their stated purpose, was to gather energy to, you know, energize your energy body to the point where you could travel into another dimension.
Just as an aside, I've read in several places that Castaneda was very influenced by Gurdjieff. And I'm not sure, they never really go into that, but I know Gurdjieff firsthand. I know, not from him directly, but from students of his, that there are movements that he discovered or originated that are meant for gathering power. So I think that may have had something to do with the source, those movements, possibly.
Yeah, he's come up quite a bit in my research on this, sort of tangentially, not really saying too much about him. It's always as a reference, but yes, I think his work was very influential on especially the tensegrity stuff. I think he also may have talked about certain movements and things like that as well. So here we come to the part of the story, right? And we're looking at the OA. So Prairie Johnson meets this guy, Hap, and Hap is convinced that, you know, there is something to near-death experiences, and he's trying to investigate what's going on. And he discovers that while these people are dead for a short period of time, their consciousness is traveling into another dimension. And he's actually developing this technology that can record sound in other dimensions. And he has these audio recordings of conversations that are happening in another dimension between the person that he just drowned to death in this tank that he puts over their head and somebody else. So he's convinced that traveling to another dimension is possible, but you know, as far as he knows, you have to die to go there. So he's doing this scientific research, and he has 5 people locked in a cave underneath his house. So he lives, you know, very in a remote area. He's very secretive and private, and he has these 5 people locked up in his basement. And, you know, Prairie Johnson, I think, was the 4th. And then they added this woman from Mexico or South America named Renata. And Renata is the name of one of the women also that followed Castaneda, not one of the women that vanished, but still. You know, Prairie Johnson has an NDE. What he was doing was he was dosing them with scopolamine so that they would be compliant when he put this tank over their head and drowned them, so that they wouldn't resist. And that when they came back, when he revived them, they would answer all of his questions. And so Prairie decided that she was going to go through it without the scopolamine. So he would put it into a gas into their cells that they were in, but somehow she was able to pretend to be knocked out. And then he would lead her upstairs, and then she traveled and she gained a movement. One of the 5 movements that were integral for traveling to another dimension. And then she came back, and then she taught that movement to the other 4. And then after a while, other people started to do it. And then they got all 5 movements. and they were practicing them, and they were able to bring a guy back from the dead. And before that, they were all planning to leave doing the movements, but Hap caught on and he started learning them as well. And then he realized he didn't need Prairie anymore, and he dumps her at the side of a road, and she finds her way back home to her parents, where she sort of reappears after being gone for 7 years. And then she recruits 5 more people and teaches them the movements. And so Hap and the others that were remaining, the 5 of them, did the movements and traveled into another dimension. So now we get to the part where these 5 women here, you've got Patty Parton, or Patricia Parton, also called Nuri Alexander, or otherwise known as the Blue Scout. You have Florinda Donner Groh, or Regine Thal, Amalia Marquez, who I believe was the president or CEO of Clear Green. You've had Tasha Abelar, who's, wrote that book that we read from, and then Kylie Lundahl, who was the tensegrity instructor. And she was also in Castaneda's will, as were Nuri Alexander and I believe Florinda as well. So at the heart of Castaneda's movement was a group of intensely devoted women, all of whom were or had been his lovers. They were known as the Witches, and 2 of them, Florinda and Tasha, vanished the day after his death, along with Clear Green president Amalia Marquez and tensegrity instructor Kylie Lundahl. A few weeks later, Patricia Parton, Castaneda's adopted daughter, as well as his lover, also disappeared. So in February 2003, a skeleton was found in Death Valley. And then in 2006, they actually positively identified it as Patricia Parton. So, I was kind of looking into that as well. Like they had to wait until the DNA technology was at a state that they could identify her remains, and it was only partial skeletal remains. So this part of the story, everyone just assumes that they all committed suicide in the desert, but Patty's body was the only one that was found. And so, some of the explanations just don't make any sense. One thing to note that in 1973, when Castaneda purchased this compound in 73, and these women started to move in, known as the Witches. They eventually came to sport identical short, dyed blonde haircuts, similar to those later worn by the Heaven's Gate cult. So, interesting side note is that April 20th, 4/20, 1997, is when the Heaven's Gate group committed suicide. And so I think it was like the person who is writing this says that Castaneda makes a comment, right? Or he hands something out on this Heaven's Gate stuff. And so he was aware of it. And I'm sure he was aware that, they were cutting their hair and dyeing it blonde. I'm sure he was aware of this group that was operating in Los Angeles, I believe, right around the same time. So on April 20th, 1997, this group commits suicide. Carlos Castaneda is reported to have died on April 27th, 1998. So just about a year later, he's dead and these women vanish. So I just thought that was an interesting thing. So, some other explanations, like what happened to Patricia Parton. So here's a quote about somebody in Castaneda's books called La Gorda, which I guess was a person that, possibly a woman, that was trying to get Castaneda to travel to another dimension with her, and she was getting impatient. So they say, La Gorda got tired of waiting around for Carlos and tried to leap by herself. She died as a result, and we buried her. And then here it says, Florinda confides to Celeste that all of the apprentices are in a terrible emotional state, describing how one of their sorcery teachers had turned old before their eyes, like the picture of Dorian Gray. It was like something you'd imagine seeing in a science fiction movie, but we actually saw it happen. So, it's quite possible that Patricia Parton tried to travel with the other 4 and something went wrong, and she didn't make it. She didn't have, enough energy or whatever, we don't really know, but to explain why only one body was found, but these 5 women disappeared on the same day. I think they were trying to travel. And I honestly don't think that Carlos Castaneda died of cancer. And possibly he had already traveled and they were trying to follow him, or, they faked his death and they were all going to travel together. And maybe Patricia didn't make it. Maybe Patricia was a sacrifice, we don't really know, but I definitely don't think she committed suicide, but only half of her body was ever recovered. Right. And they say that she went out to the most remote part of Death Valley in an extremely dangerous and remote area. They kept saying dangerous and remote, dangerous and remote. But somehow hikers found her body. Right. Because, good old hikers always seem to find bodies that are buried in the most remote places on Earth, because that's just how things work in this reality. Oh, and Michael says, I have no problem with weird movements or doing them in front of people. I am not sure why I feel an aversion to the OA. I have movements of my own that I do to move energy and have my master Reiki certification. So, yeah, I think that the show just, for whatever reason, didn't resonate with a lot of people. I've heard that from other people that, they watched the trailer for it and it just didn't interest them.
Hey, can I step in for a sec?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, guys. Oh, yeah, sorry to interject here. I'm loving this. Really great stuff, Eric. Yeah, I don't know, my feeling, I think it's towards the main character. I don't know, something about her that makes me, cringe. But, I think there's so many cool ideas in it, so I'd probably really enjoy it if I just, set that aside. But maybe it's a timing thing. You never know.
I think
just gotta wait for it.
I think season 2 is better than season 1. But season 1, you really have to watch it to understand what's going on in season 2. But yeah, I hear you, Michael. Like I honestly, when I first watched it, I thought it was kind of silly as well, but then I went back and rewatched it, and I watched it like 3 times now, and I really enjoyed it. And I think it's much better than Netflix had another show called Sense8, which is about a group of people who all seem to be connected to each other psychically. They could feel what the other person was feeling, and they could almost be in the same room with them. And it's like they could travel across space and be in the same room because they were all somehow one person connected, but they were like 6 or 7 different bodies, or 8 of them, sorry. And like, it was a good premise, but of course they had to push all kinds of other social narratives throughout the show. And that was just like, it really detracted from the other stuff that, you really want to watch the show for. So there's some interesting things with Castaneda's death, right? So April 23rd, 1998, Castaneda signs 6-page will, leaving his estate to be channeled through the Eagles Trust, established by a trust agreement signed the same day, and specifically disinheriting CJ Castaneda and Margaret Runyon. So Margaret Runyon was his ex-wife, his second wife. He had a wife in Peru and a daughter with that woman that he left very early on. And then this woman, he married fairly early, getting into the United States, and she had a son from another man that Castaneda adopted, and this is CJ Castaneda. So he disinherits both of them in his will. He also signs a quitclaim deed, apparently on the house that he had on Pandora Avenue, to the Eagle Trust, Deborah Drews as trustee, which was the attorney, I believe, that he had been working with for many years with Clear Green, which is recorded on April 29th, 1998, along with a quitclaim deed to First American Trust Company. So there was a lot of different companies that Castaneda and these women themselves had started. Many of them had multiple name changes, and there were interesting marriages that took place that could have possibly been between Castaneda and many different women under these different aliases that they had. So there's a lot to explore in that. And I just like, there's so many things to explore and go down that I would have been doing this for the rest of my life. So I just really had to like focus on certain things. And then in April 27th, 98, Castaneda's death certificate signed by Angelica Duanas, MD. And I still need to look into this woman, whether or not, you know, she's probably a legitimate doctor, but I'm wondering if there's any connection between her and Castaneda, because he died at his home, which was a compound, you know, that only he and these women had access to. And other than them, this is the only person that supposedly saw his body or did any sort of autopsy. She reports his death at 3 a.m. that date, his cremation on that date by Spalding Mortuary in Culver City, and the disposition of the remains to Talia Bay on April 28th. So like, he's dead and he's cremated and his ashes are being sent to Mexico like a day later, right? That's very hasty. Death certificate lists immediate cause of death as a metabolic encephalopathy for a period of 2 days, triggered by liver failure for a period of 2 weeks due to hepatocellular cancer for a period of 10 months. So that's very confusing. So I decided to start looking into what is metabolic encephalopathy, and what is this hepatocellular carcinoma, right? So this is the most common type of primary liver cancer in adults and is currently the most common cause of death in people with cirrhosis. I don't know if Castaneda was a big drinker or not, but supposedly, you know, he got liver cancer, and then because of that, he got this metabolic encephalopathy. This was interesting. The vast majority of this particular type of cancer occurs in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, in countries where hepatitis B infection is endemic, and many are infected from birth. So that's interesting, right? So what is metabolic encephalopathy? Well, this is something that is caused by this drug here. Melarsoprol is a medication used for the treatment of sleeping sickness, African trypanosomiasis. It's specifically used for second stage disease caused by this and when the central nervous system involved. So, you know, like the side effects include brain dysfunction, numbness, rashes, kidney and liver problems. About 1 to 5% of people die during treatment. So this drug used to treat African sleeping sickness is only given to people that are in stage 2 of this disease, right? And this disease is caused, it says down here, it's an insect-borne parasitic infection of humans and other animals, and it's caused by the tsetse fly. I guess that's how you pronounce it, right? And it's very common to sub-Saharan Africa. The disease occurs regularly in some regions of sub-Saharan Africa. So here we have yet another reference to sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, this drug can cause metabolic encephalopathy. And so I just thought that was interesting. Like, what's really going on with his death? Did he actually have cancer? You know, was he poisoned? You know, was it murder? Or did he just fake his own death? Because the fact that he was dead and then cremated and shipped off to Mexico a day later, and presumably only the women that he lived with, this doctor that signed the death certificate, and possibly the mortuary, were the only people that ever saw his body. So we'll never really know. But, some clues were given by Carol Teagues. She says here, in May 98, during a telephone conversation, Carol told me that despite an original plan that she would leave with the others, this is talking about this idea that they were all going to travel to another dimension. A non-decision kept me here. She also did not expressly confirm Castaneda's death, but stated vaguely that Castaneda was in one place and that the other 5, including the other 2 witches, were elsewhere looking around. And then down here, Carol claimed that Castaneda recently saw himself as a bundle of energy, which was a sign that he was on the verge of leaving. The umbrella of energy they assertedly received from Don Juan was gone. As we make the final turn, we are going to have to do so on our own power. We are also told that Castaneda felt with his exposed knees that Carol's mother was not her mother. Like that was yet another reference to the OA where, she was adopted, right? And so Castaneda was sort of implying that maybe Carol's parents weren't even really her parents. So yet another parallel to the connection between her and the Prairie Johnson character in the OA. And Castaneda reportedly tells the group that he and the others will be leaving soon because Carol is starting to burn, and that Talia Bay will remain to continue running things after they leave because of her appropriate green-hued energy. And Talia Bay is the one who, I guess, was the recipient of Castaneda's ashes when he supposedly died. So they were already talking like in 96 about traveling. And then Carol said after they were gone, that she didn't want to go with them, or, she just didn't decide. And so she was stuck. She was left behind. The obituary for Castaneda didn't appear until June 19th, 1998. So he died on supposedly April 27th. And then June 19th is when they actually print his obituary. I thought that was interesting. Until they leave the telephone unanswered, starting at around 2 p.m., Clear Green staffers give different responses to callers asking where the witches are. So I don't even, they don't seem to have really had any idea where these people were or if they actually traveled. So it's hard to tell who was really in on anything. The last thing, I wanted to talk about, there's some speculation that Castaneda himself was early on involved with, the CIA or other intelligence operations going on. And, a lot of the stuff he was doing was not that far off from things that like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey were doing. And, we know the connections there with those people. So this person, Manuel Carballal, author of The Secret Life of Carlos Castaneda, compares him to Charles Manson. He says both of them led a sect in California in the 60s. They were both called Carlos, were short, and looked alike. I mean, I don't know that that's really a huge connection there, but I definitely got a vibe that, Castaneda, they were trying to make him out to be like Charles Manson, but nothing that happened with his group would really make him anything like Manson. So, I think that there's a push by the media to paint the story in a certain light, right? They want to make these connections between Manson. They want to connect him to Heaven's Gate. They really want this whole thing to just be a cult and people who committed suicide. And I don't know why, because maybe like the truth is just too out of this world to believe. I don't know. This was interesting, something I found. In Amy Wallace's account of being married to Carlos Castaneda, a sorcerer's apprentice, and Debby, this is the book Debby tells me is very salacious. So just keep that in mind. She recounts how Castaneda confessed to having worked as an assassin for an unnamed government agency. On other occasions, he mentioned the CIA and U.S. military intelligence. A friend who roomed with Castaneda in 1957 said he had heard similar stories from Carlos. Castaneda's first wife, actually his second, Margaret Runyon, recounted a story he told of being seriously wounded while serving in an intelligence division in Spain or Korea. Those are like really far apart. According to Wallace, Castaneda even confessed his secret to his Nagual, sorcerer master Don Juan. Wallace quotes Carlos as saying, "Later, when I had met Don Juan, I told him I had a terrible secret, terrible, the worst, and I had never confessed it. I had been Don Juan's apprentice for years before I found the courage to speak of this horror. Tell me, estúpido," said Don Juan, "what can be so bad, eh? Is this why you always so heavy, so pesado? Why do I have to stand on my head to move you an inch? What is it, this terrible thing you did?" He says, "I killed people, Don Juan, lots of people. That's it. You killed people?" Anyway, he goes on to, talk about how that's not really that big of a deal. According to Wallace, Castaneda was trying to turn his experiences with the CIA or whoever into a novel in his final months of life. He called it Assassin. So I don't really know if that was true. It's really difficult to say. But anyway, there's my presentation and my connections to the OA. And as Alex has brought up too, like connections to Twin Peaks. So I'd love to hear from you guys and what you think about this and the, is it plausible? Is it possible?
Yeah, it's very cool. It's really good, interesting kind of link to the OA. And what it made me think of is a documentary or a lecture I watched a while ago. And it was just saying that there's only like 10 or 11 stories written throughout history, and they're just rehashed again and again and again. And they all come in these different forms, and it's from like Roman mythology through Hindu mythology, through Islamic, through Christian, through all different kinds of mediums. And then modern media is the most prevalent of this. And who was it that referred Star Wars trilogy back to an old movie where I'm trying to remember his name. He's a really famous British actor, and he goes into a tribal scenario. It's perhaps called The King. I think it's Michael Caine. And he goes into this tribe, and somebody made like a kind of walkthrough, a little bit like you did, of the similarities between Star Wars and this movie that are seemingly totally unconnected, but each character has a very specific archetype, and the structure of the story is very much the same. Like when a guy made a documentary recently, I can't remember his name, it was something Gray, and his whole family had been killed. Apparently, it seems to be legit. He was making a movie about the government. That's right, Michael's just put The Man Who Would Be King. Was the movie I was talking about.
Wasn't that Sean Connery?
Maybe that's right. Yeah, maybe I had this mental image of Michael Caine in my mind, and it was back Sean Connery.
Yeah, so
both Michaels.
I think that was the movie where that was like overtly Masonic.
Yeah.
Go ahead though.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, they all have this kind of archetypal format, and it seems like this story is a very key story, but there was perhaps a lot more raw quality to this, which is like those stories are meant to be very mysterious and covered up, whereas this is quite a direct story. And when you read it, it's hard not to relate an experience through the story. I find, just personally, I found that through it. And there was one other point I wanted to put forward, which was I'd been listening to Ram Dass recently, who's quite an interesting guy. And I stayed away from listening to people like this for a long time because I just don't really like listening to gurus or self-proclaimed gurus. But he's quite a different guy listening to him. And he'd put forward that he spoke with, I think it was Nathan Rockefeller. And he was saying, like, out of all the people I've met, like, I've got the chance to meet a lot of kind of well-known, powerful people. Then he talked with him, and he was talking about kind of the psychology of people in general, like group psychology. And he put forward a question, like Rockefeller was proposing, like, oh, we need to make the people think this way and this way. And it got my mind thinking that these people in power, like, they seem to play a role, like they've opted to play a role, like the Queen or the Rockefeller family or Trump or Biden or whatever. It's people who are trained up to play a very specific role. But I have this kind of nagging feeling now that, like, there's no such thing as this real evil. What's behind it is a kind of force that seems to help people forward and push them forward, but puts them into stress situations. And this story of Carlos and Don Juan seems to be very much like so allegorical to everything else. And so many other things that I've seen since then are like, oh, right, that relates to kind of that stopping the world feeling, like that grasping enlightenment or Zen, like what Alan Watts talks about. But yeah, those are just thoughts that came to my mind while listening.
Well, certainly Castaneda, as well as his teachers, Don Juan and his whole party, Don Gennaro, they were, throughout all the works, they are constantly putting people under immense stress to, you know, talk about vitriol. That was their, you know, a major technique that they used for helping people alchemize. So the other thing that came to my mind is that Carlos, being a stalker, was constantly changing everything about himself, whether it was his name or his dates or, you know, just where he had been, etc. And that is definitely part of stalking, is creating this sort of mystique about yourself so that no one really knows what you are or who you are. And he's constantly changing the rules of the game. And Amy Wallace talks about that a lot. Like, they were always under the stress. She and the other apprentices were always under the stress of having to figure out what the rules were, because they were always changing and they were always getting in trouble because they were breaking the rules, but they didn't know what the rules were. So yeah, in terms of parallels to,
I think these called, sorry, Eric, you were going to speak on that.
I was just
I'm
going to
done.
say that the trickster archetype is often employed in magic, right? If you're trying to do alchemy on another person, like what these sorcerers were doing to the apprentices, they would take on the trickster archetype sometimes, and they would play tricks on them and fool them, and to push them to really draw out something greater from that person, because nobody really goes through a transformation just by having an easy go of it and just having a good old time. Like, that's not how it works. So transformation is typically brought on through stress, through challenge, through trauma. And sometimes in order to draw that transformation out in people, the magician or the sorcerer will have to play the trickster. And I think if you're looking at the greater reality that we all experience, if you look at it like an ARG from that perspective, that at some point, if you're playing the game, then you realize it is a game. And at some point when you're playing this game, you get to a certain level where you can now become an actor in the greater game and perform a role of like a trickster, right? Or you play a character that has a specific purpose designed to draw out something in the larger population of people, as far as alchemy goes and transformation. So I just wanted to throw that out there too, because I think this connection to ARGs, like with life itself, is quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think like what we're saying about people playing certain roles, and like the Zen master, the guru, he's kind of willingly playing a role that you're just there's everything, you can do all of these things yourself, like as a person, but the guru is standing in there as somebody who's like a trickster who's just taking on a role to reflect certain qualities in yourself. And I was thinking about this like with cults too, that when people join them, or religions, there's a certain weakness or vulnerability or lacking in certain aspect of their life, and they go into that to fulfill that particular aspect of their life. And then some people get completely stuck in there. It's like an experience that they need. And I think with Carlos Castaneda, that whole story, it's like it evokes something really deep within all of us, unless we quickly want to block up those walls of mystery. And it seems like a lot of these stories, there's a lot of work done to kind of brick wall it up, like just don't look there, or cast enough doubt on it. And then you have to overcome within yourself another obstacle of like, right, there's a lot of writing against this particular thing. Now, do I turn back, or do I continue, or like take a third very like awareness look at it, where you just assess everything and try not to come to decisions about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, so from your perspective, like Alex, you said that you were very into on your way to wanting to be a shaman, and Castaneda was, you know, huge in as an influence on your move to that kind of lifestyle and wanting to pursue that. And Debby, he's been somebody that's been heavily influential on your life as well. And so I guess when, you know, you guys both told me that it was very discouraging to find out that, you know, he could have been a fraud, and that these women killed themselves, and, you know, it's just such a tragic, sad story. And that's, you know, if you look at the mainstream story about it, it really is. It's just like, wow, this is so tragic. I mean, you know, these women killed themselves, but not because Carlos told them to. It's just because he died, and they were just so racked with shame and guilt and sadness. But, you know, when you really dig into it, and you don't have to dig in that far, all of that, the mainstream narrative just falls apart, and none of it makes sense. And so having like looked at it in comparison with this show, the OA, which is really about, you know, the ability to travel into other dimensions, levels of consciousness, and that, you know, these physical movements can change your energy body and help aid in that travel. And I just, you know, when I'm looking at the Castaneda story, it looks to me like, you know, they traveled, you know, they knew what they were doing. And that part of the reason that this narrative has come up, that it's all a fraud and it's a cult, and that they're, you know, it's just suicide, is to discourage you from really digging into it, or for people who are really into his work, you know, to discourage them. And, you know, sometimes when you're teaching somebody, you try to actively discourage them from seeking the truth in order to see if they really want the truth or not. Because many times people will turn from that path, and they will give up the search because they were easily discouraged. And one who is able to receive these higher truths wouldn't be worthy if they were easily discouraged. So that's also another technique, right? We see a lot of these stories surrounding a lot of different weird things that have happened. And it's like, oh, here's a dumb explanation that doesn't make any sense. And if you question it, you're crazy. Just go on about your business. And it's not that like they really think that people who want to explore this stuff are crazy. They just really want to see who's easily discouraged and who has what it takes to keep going. And so I wonder, having this fresh perspective on it, if it's maybe changed your minds a little bit, made you rethink how you initially thought about this.
Well, totally. I actually had already reached that point, although this just nails it home. Thank you very much for this excellent detective work that you've done, which I would never, you know, I probably couldn't do it the way that you do it. So I really appreciate it. It just verifies that I didn't give up on it. And I just, I find his words so inspiring. Then my distress at reading Amy Wallace's book was temporary, and I still have those books right by my bedside and I read them regularly. So this is just a nice confirmation of that. So thank you.
Yeah, for me, I'd also went through that at a kind of really quick speed. I'd heard about Castaneda for a long, long time, but it was always like secondhand through other people telling stories about Castaneda. And then only more recently, when you'd mentioned it, Debbie, I'd ordered the book and read through it myself, and then did kind of some digging into it and into the story. And I went through that period really quickly of like jumping into belief about it, because it resonated very much with a lot of the other things that I'd been looking at. And it was like another piece of the puzzle. And then kind of finding like a lot of negative things written about it, it made me more analyze my own belief rather than the story, and being like, oh, how quick I was to jump into belief of another matter. And like, even today I did it with something and I kind of laughed at myself, like, oh, I was so ready to like dive into belief in that again. And I'm really kind of having a different awareness now. When I hear things, it's like, okay, that's interesting, and just look at it and not be reactionary. So but with this story, I find the more that information that comes up on it, the more interesting it is, because it seems like there's a lot more theater gone on afterwards. And is it like some things written by other people to kind of embellish and put more mystery into it, and then on the same side other people trying to take that mystery away? It's like, it's funny, it causes a reaction within people where some people want to dive into the mystery and some people want to brick wall the mystery. So you get both of those things happening, and that's very interesting because of the effect that it has on people, how scared some people are that their reality is not the only reality, and how willing some other people are to like abandon this reality in favor of another reality. And that, when I hear the Chocomules talk, at first I had a really cynical outlook on the tensegrity videos, and I watched them and I was like, immediately had this inner reaction of like, this is not believable. This is not, like, it's totally different from the books and my imagination of the books and what I drew from the books. When I see this, it seems a little bit theatrical and kind of made for TV, and it has an air of marketing, and a lot of things soured my thoughts on it. But then when I heard them speak, I was like, these people really believe it. They really, really believe it. And it kind of took away my cynicism again. So I just find the whole story so interesting because it evokes a lot of belief and reaction.
Well, not to mention that, plenty of other cultures have movements, poses, like you have Tai Chi, you have Qigong,
I've got a good story about that after you speak.
The martial arts, and all of these women and Castaneda were very into martial arts as well. Another show about traveling to other realities or other dimensions, The Man in the High Castle, which is a Philip K. Dick novel. The main character, one of the women who's able to travel by herself without the aid of any kind of technology, she's very into Aikido and into the Japanese culture. She's into the I Ching, and her boss is also very into the I Ching, and he does these katas in the park where he practices this stick movement that, as part of, like, I don't know if he's actually a samurai, but it's like something a samurai would do to just practice his movements and his concentration and meditation. So like you see this theme, you have yoga, you have mudras, you have certain temple dancing. You see this throughout history in all these different cultures. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that there's no like one right set of movements that can accomplish this task. I think most of it is really just about intent and your focus and the amount of attention and focus you put into these movements. So I don't think there's, like a lot of these things look like they're made for TV or almost too ridiculous to believe. And yet the women themselves took them absolutely seriously. I mean, you can tell that they're not acting. A lot of them felt uncomfortable. One of them on that video that you're talking about, Alex, she just looked like she'd never been on camera before. She didn't know where to look. She kept laughing and it was very like uncomfortable and odd. But, you know, when they did those movements, you could tell they practiced those all the time. They're very well versed in these movements. And so, you know, I believe that it's possible. I believe that you can leave this reality and travel into another dimension or another reality, whatever that looks like, however that experience would be. I have no idea. And I'm sure there's so many types of, you know, experiences people have had that there isn't just like one way it's going to be, just like there's no one movement that's going to get you there. And you can probably do it through deep meditation as well without any of these movements. But I know, or I shouldn't say I know, I believe that there's more out there than just this reality and this world, and that there are probably many ways to get there, and there are probably many other realities. So when I look at this story, what I see is, you know, a group of people who probably privately were very committed to what they were doing and knew very well what their intent was. And many of them achieved that goal. You know, where they went, we have no idea. But I don't think these women just committed suicide. They don't seem suicidal to me. And Castaneda doesn't come off as a guy who would inspire people to kill themselves. You know, so sometimes I think like the mainstream understanding of these things is very, very base, and it's hard for them to fathom that people would let their physical body die in order to exist in another dimension. It's like we're sort of taught in this culture, especially in America and in the West, that, you know, this is everything, right? You have to do everything not to die. We have to protect you at all costs. You have to give up all your rights for safety, and you have to, you know, hide away for 1.5 years from something that could potentially kill you, maybe. You know, and nobody's really living. You know, you just see a lot of people waiting around to die, trying not to die as soon as maybe they could. And that's not really living. Having this immense fear of death, this being so scared of death that you'll do anything not to die, you know, to me, it seems ridiculous, and it's counter to what life is really about. If you have no fear of death and you look at death as just a transition, then you're willing to take risks, and you're willing to put yourself out there, and you're willing to do things that could yield, you know, major benefits for not only you, but other people around you. But people are so scared that they don't take risks, and they don't do anything, and they don't have big lives. They have very small, insignificant, tiny lives because they want it to be that way. They don't believe that they could ever have a big, you know, fantastic life. It's not that you have to be famous or well known, right? But your life can be big and infamous in your own mind. It's all about how you perceive what you're doing. And if people perceive themselves as nobodies, and they're just trying to get by, and I'm just trying to pay my bills and feed my family, and, you know, I'm really just trying not to die here. Like, what, you know, that to me is not living. And it's sad. So when you hear people that are doing something fantastic and amazing, you just want to immediately crap all over it and denounce it and say how crazy and stupid it is. And, you know, because everybody else in the majority is going to be behind you and, you know, casting stones, right? We all want to burn a witch. Everybody loves to burn witches. And that's really what I see this as. They even called these women Castaneda's witches. they burn in these witches because they don't want to believe that there is something else out there beyond this reality. And so it must be just a cult suicide, end of story. Anyway,
Yes. Yeah. The clutching and clawing for each little shred of life and each little, that I see people doing at the end of their lives. It's, these books inspire you to realize that you get to choose how you die. That's a huge thing. And in many ways, life is a preparation for that moment. It's really, Castaneda talks about death being over your left shoulder at all times. So I think that is something that really influenced me, those ideas. And what you said, Eric, you explained it really well, how the fear of death is bad. We're all going to die. And the fact that that's like unusual when it comes up is so weird when you think about it, when the conversation about that comes up, it's always so unusual and weird.
Well, I mean, one way I've thought about it before is if you look at so much in this world as being inverted or a shadow of the more real, right? So the things that we see and experience in this reality are just shadows of a greater reality. And if you look at things as inverted, right, then birth would be death. Being born into this world is dying, and dying is being born into the greater reality. And so you should actually look forward to your death, right? The period of time that you're quote unquote alive in this reality is really your time in the underworld. And that when you die, right, you hope to transcend or leave. So, I mean, you can look at it that way as well, that death is actually birth and that birth is death. So I want to give Michael an opportunity to weigh in before we wrap it up if he so chooses. But if he's too busy, I understand.
Hey, just finished loading up the storage. So yeah, I'll say a few things. First of all, Eric, great presentation. I really appreciate you putting that together, and it was really cool to listen while I moved everything. And good work. As far as like Castaneda goes, I was really influenced by him when I was maybe 16. Reading his books really like gave me this energy and possibilities that I hadn't thought before. And it was really influential in my like seeking of self and understanding my inner world. And it helped me, a lot of his books, and I didn't know this until later when actually Debby mentioned it, but how I started dreaming later in life and being aware of my dreams was actually a technique that was in one of the Castaneda books, and it's looking at your hands. And I had totally forgotten about that and didn't make that connection before Debby mentioned it to me. But yeah, I'm able to feel between both worlds when I look at my hands in my dreams. So what I will say about like Castaneda as an individual, and a lot of the people that I have found interest in, like even Gordon Wasson, Leary, people like Burroughs, the chaos magicians of the time, they all have these two-sided stories. Wasson supposedly worked with CIA, had all these ties, and you can never see, I never see someone as totally on a bad side or a good side. We're all people, we're all trying to live in this material world and live within our inner worlds and the worlds that are created in between those. I do think allies, which Carlos calls like the mushrooms and the peyote, and a lot of these drugs are allies, and you can use them to explore parts of reality. And these are worlds in themselves. So there is always that value there and that knowledge that can be learned. And yeah, it's possible that Castaneda was working for, like pharmaceutical companies could have, like they have a lot of money to give to people that are experimenting with drugs, just for notes and that kind of thing, and how it's able to be used. Like there's a couple letters between Wasson and Castaneda, and just with Wasson trying to get some information about Don Juan and about kind of the mushroom, which was one of Don Juan's allies. And that's a bit telling there. Castaneda was definitely leaving out some parts, obviously, but because I don't think he wanted to focus too much on the analytical side of it. It kind of takes the magic out of the moment. He did have a lot of field notes and stuff too, but when you're exploring consciousness, you can't always explain it to someone that wants to use it as like say a pharmaceutical drug company or the CIA for mind control purposes or these kinds of things. So I always with these kind of figures, there's always these two sides, and there's always battling between, and the people that say, oh, they're just working for the CIA trying to mind control, they're evil people, and then there's people that don't even believe that was a part of it. I think it's somewhere in between, honestly. Yeah, I mean, you got to make a living some way and feed yourself and all that stuff. So anyway, guys, thanks so much for doing this, and great to listen to you all, and have a great Sunday. Thanks for letting me speak.
You too, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thank you for taking time out from, moving, or at least listening while you're moving, but to chime in there at the end. I appreciate that. And Debbie and Alex, thank you guys for being here and for sharing your views on this stuff. And, like, we're never really going to know exactly what happened, but, in my mind, I think I'd like to tell myself the story I told today rather than, believe the story that we're presented with, because to me, you can always choose to see things from a different perspective, and you can choose to look at something from, a sad, tragic, hopeless point of view, or you can choose to see it as, a very hopeful and exciting point of view where, maybe there is a little bit of secrecy involved and we don't really know, but the hope that it's possible that we could, be traveling to other worlds. I mean, that's certainly something that I've been focused on a lot and will continue to focus on, because, I believe that it's possible. And I, to a degree, I believe it's possible for myself in this lifetime. So, it's definitely something that's part of me and how I approach the world. And so when I see a story like this, it's just, I'm like, I have to go that direction. And hopefully, you guys have a little bit better perspective on it now than maybe you did before. But, thank you guys for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. And, for the people watching, this is probably the last one I'll do on Castaneda, but we're, definitely going to get into some other topics. I have some other things that I'm wanting to look into with just found like a Tartarian star fort like 33 minutes from me. So I'm going to be checking that out and see what I can find on that. And, for YouTube, like there has absolutely been no mention of any violent criminal organization in this video. So just saying. All right. Anyway, thanks for being here, guys. And I'll talk to you all later.